The evening started like any other special occasion. After 15 years of dedicated service in the Air Force, Major Anderson had just received news of her promotion. She wanted to treat herself to something nice, a quiet, elegant dinner at River Heights, one of the most talked-about restaurants in downtown Atlanta. She'd walked past it countless times, always admiring the warm glow from its windows and the mouth-watering aromas that drifted onto the street. She'd made sure everything was perfect for the evening. Her military medals gleamed on her dress uniform, each one telling a story of courage and service. Her hair was neatly styled, and she'd even put on the pearl earrings her grandmother had given her when she graduated from the Air Force Academy. As she stepped out of her car, the valet's eyes widened slightly at her uniform, and she felt a small surge of pride. This was her moment to celebrate. The restaurant's entrance was grand, with polished brass handles and soft lighting that spilled onto the sidewalk. Major Anderson checked her watch, 7:00 p.m., right on time for her reservation. As she pushed open the heavy door, the warm air inside carried the scent of fresh-baked bread and grilled steaks. Her stomach growled softly, reminding her she'd been looking forward to this all day. But something felt off the moment she stepped inside. The host, a tall man with thin-rimmed glasses, was all smiles as he greeted a couple ahead of her. Then his eyes landed on her, and his expression changed so subtly that someone else might have missed it. But after years of navigating spaces where she was often the only black officer, Major Anderson had become finely tuned to these micro-shifts in people's faces. "Good evening," she said warmly, maintaining her professional demeanor. "I have a reservation for 7:00. The host's fingers hovered over his tablet, his eyes not quite meeting hers. "A reservation? Are you sure it was for tonight?" Major Anderson kept her voice steady. "Yes, I spoke with someone named Chris yesterday. Party of one, 7:00 p.m. The host scrolled through his tablet with exaggerated slowness. Behind her, the door opened, and another couple walked in. Without looking up, the host immediately called out, "Good evening. I'll be right with you." Minutes ticked by. Major Anderson watched as other guests were promptly seated. A business group that came in after her, an elderly couple, a family with teenagers. Each time, the host would look up, smile broadly, and escort them to their tables. Each time, she stood there, her feet beginning to ache in her dress shoes, her hunger turning from anticipation to discomfort. "Perhaps there's been a mistake," the host finally said, his voice dripping with fake concern. "We have very high standards here, you see. Our reservation system is quite particular." The words hung in the air like smoke. Major Anderson felt her chest tighten, but years of military training kept her posture straight and her face composed. She reached for her phone, pulled up the confirmation email, and held it out. "Here's my confirmation. As you can see, everything is in order." The host barely glanced at the screen. Well, he paused as more guests entered, offering them another bright good evening, before turning back to her with a considerably cooler expression. "You're welcome to wait in the bar area. We'll see what we can do." The bar area was a small space near the entrance, separated from the main dining room by an ornate divider. As Major Anderson stood there, she couldn't help but notice she was the only black person in sight. The weight of that reality, one she'd faced so many times before, settled on her shoulders like a familiar but unwelcome burden. Through the divider, she could see empty tables, several of them, their white tablecloths gleaming under soft lighting. She watched as people who came in after her were seated at those very tables, their reservations apparently free of any system issues. Her phone buzzed. It was a message from her squadron mates, congratulating her again on the promotion. The irony wasn't lost on her. Here she was, a decorated major in the United States Air Force, someone who had flown combat missions and led troops, being treated like an unwelcome intruder at a restaurant in her own hometown. The minutes stretched into a half hour. Her feet hurt, her pride stung, and her hunger had turned to a knot in her stomach. But Major Anderson stood tall, just as she had through basic training, through combat, through every challenge that had tried to break her spirit. This was just another battlefield, she thought, though the weapons here were subtle and the wounds invisible to the eye. She could feel eyes on her, quick glances from other patrons, whispered conversations behind hands, the occasional look of discomfort or pity from those who realized what was happening. The host continued his performance, checking his tablet periodically while seating other guests with flourishing efficiency. This wasn't just about dinner anymore. It wasn't even about the reservation. As she stood there, Major Anderson thought about every young black girl who dreamed of achieving something, every veteran who deserved respect regardless of their skin color, every person who had ever been made to feel less than worthy. She thought about how this same scene was probably playing out in other places to other people at this very moment. The restaurant's warm lighting and elegant decor, which had seemed so inviting from the outside, now felt like a stage set for a performance of exclusion, one that had been playing for far too long. But even as the humiliation attempted to take root, something else was growing in Major Anderson's mind. This moment, as painful as it was, would not be the end of the story, not if she had anything to say about it. After 45 minutes of standing in the bar area, Major Anderson was finally led to a table, tucked away in a dark corner near the kitchen doors, despite the multiple empty spots in the main dining area. The sound of clattering dishes and shouting kitchen staff nearly drowned out the soft jazz playing throughout the restaurant. She took a deep breath, smoothed her uniform, and sat down with the dignity that had carried her through 15 years of military service. The small table wobbled when she rested her arms on it. A quick glance showed a wadded-up napkin stuck under one leg, clearly a long-standing issue that nobody had bothered to fix properly. The leather-bound menu placed in front of her had a visible water stain on the corner, unlike the pristine ones she'd seen at other tables. 10 minutes passed before anyone approached her table. She watched other diners receive water, bread baskets, and warm greetings almost immediately after being seated. The servers moved efficiently between tables, their attention flowing naturally to every guest, except her corner. She observed it all with the careful eye of someone who'd spent years analyzing battlefield situations. This wasn't random neglect, it was calculated. When a server finally arrived, he barely made eye contact. His pencil tapped impatiently against his notepad as Major Anderson began to order. "The wine list?" she asked politely. "Oh," he said, his voice carrying a note of surprise that made her stomach clench. "Of course." He returned several minutes later, dropping the wine list on the table without a word and walking away before she could speak. The surrounding tables continued to receive attentive service. At one nearby table, a server was enthusiastically describing the evening specials, his hands gesturing expressively as he detailed the preparation of each dish. Major Anderson hadn't been told about any specials. Her water glass remained empty. The bread basket never arrived. She could feel occasional stares from other diners, some curious, others uncomfortable, a few showing hints of recognition about what was happening. A couple at a nearby table whispered to each other, throwing glances her way that felt like tiny paper cuts against her skin. Through the kitchen doors, she caught snippets of conversation that made her blood run cold. "Watch that table carefully," she heard someone say, presumably the manager. "Make sure everything is, handled properly." The implications hung in the air like a heavy fog. When she finally managed to order a simple salmon dish and a glass of white wine, the server's response was a curt nod. No questions about how she'd like it prepared, no suggestions for wine pairing, none of the warmth she'd observed in his interactions with other guests. 20 minutes passed. Her empty water glass sat like a silent accusation. She watched plates of steaming food being delivered to tables that had been seated long after her. The couple next to her received their entrees, complete with the server's flourishing presentation and detailed description of each element on the plate. The manager walked by her table several times, never once checking on her experience, though she noticed him stopping at nearly every other table with a warm smile and a "How is everything this evening?" His path through the dining room seemed specifically designed to avoid her corner, except when he needed to pass through to the kitchen. During those moments, she caught him giving her table what he probably thought were subtle glances. Her wine arrived after 30 minutes, in a glass with visible lipstick marks on the rim. When she politely pointed this out, the server's response was a barely concealed eye roll and a muttered, "Some people are never satisfied," as he walked away. The small indignities continued to pile up. A busboy clearing the next table knocked into her chair without apologizing. Her food, when it finally arrived, was barely warm, suggesting it had been left sitting while other orders took priority. The salmon was overcooked to the point of being dry, nothing like the perfectly prepared dishes she could see at surrounding tables. But what cut deeper than any of these obvious slights was the whispered conversation she overheard between two servers near the kitchen door. "Can you believe she's actually military?" one said. "Must be some kind of costume." The other replied with a snicker, "Well, you know how they like to play dress-up." Major Anderson's hand tightened around her fork. In that moment, she felt the weight of every medal on her uniform, medals earned through courage, dedication, and sacrifice. Each one represented moments where she'd proven herself in situations far more challenging than this. She thought about the troops she'd led, the missions she'd completed, the lives she'd helped save. And here she was, being treated as if none of that mattered, as if her uniform was just a costume, as if her very presence was an inconvenience to be tolerated rather than a guest to be served. The evening she had planned as a celebration of her promotion had transformed into a reminder of battles she thought, or at least hoped, belonged to a different era. But as she sat there, maintaining her composure despite every slight, something shifted in her mind. This wasn't just about one bad dying experience. This was about a deeper problem, one that required a different kind of strategy than she'd initially imagined. Later that night, Major Anderson sat in her living room, still in her dress uniform, staring at the wall of family photos before her. The house was quiet except for the soft ticking of her grandfather's old clock, a family heirloom that had witnessed 3 generations of struggle and triumph. Her fingers traced over the medals on her uniform, each one a reminder of the barriers she'd broken and the challenges she overcome. The Distinguished Flying Cross caught the lamplight, bringing back memories of that mission over hostile territory, where split-second decisions meant the difference between life and death. Back then, her crew hadn't cared about her skin color, they'd only cared that she got them home safely. The evening's events kept replaying in her mind like a bad movie she couldn't turn off. The host's dismissive looks, the server's cold shoulder, the whispered comments, the dirty wine glass. Each memory brought a fresh wave of anger and hurt, emotions she'd learned to control through years of military discipline. She walked to her bookshelf and pulled out an old photo album. Inside was a black and white photograph of her grandfather in his World War I uniform, standing proud despite the segregation he faced in the military he served. He used to tell her stories about those days, about being forced to eat in separate mess halls, about leading missions in Europe only to come home and be treated like a second-class citizen. "Baby girl," he told her once, "there are 2 ways to fight a battle. You can burn everything down, or you can build something better." She remembered how his eyes had sparkled with wisdom as he'd said those words, his weathered hands gesturing for emphasis. The first way might feel good for a minute, but the second way? That changes things forever. The memory brought tears to her eyes. She wiped them away quickly, a habit formed from years of showing strength in front of her troops. Her phone had been buzzing all evening with messages from friends and fellow officers congratulating her on the promotion. How strange that on the same day she'd reached this career milestone, she'd also been reminded that some people would only ever see her skin color. She walked to her home office, where her military awards and certificates covered one wall. Next to them hung her business degree from Georgetown, earned through night classes while serving active duty. Her grandfather's words echoed in her mind, "Build something better." The urge to act, to do something, was overwhelming. Her first instinct was to file a formal complaint, to blast the restaurant on social media, to let the local news stations know how a decorated veteran had been treated. Her phone was right there, and she knew the story would spread like wildfire. The restaurant would face a backlash, and maybe that's what they deserved. But as she paced her office, another thought began to take shape. She remembered her early days in the Air Force, when she'd been one of the few black female pilots. How she'd changed minds not through confrontation, but through excellence. How her leadership had transformed her squadron's culture, making it more inclusive without ever having to raise her voice. She sat at her desk and opened her laptop. The restaurant's website glowed on the screen. She began researching, her military training kicking in, gather intelligence, analyze the situation, identify the core problem. The restaurant's social media pages showed a clear pattern. Their staff and clientele were overwhelmingly homogeneous. Reviews from minority customers told similar stories to her experience, though none had developed into major incidents. As midnight approached, she found herself thinking about the younger generation of officers she mentored. What would she tell them to do in this situation? How could this moment become a teaching opportunity rather than just another story of discrimination? Her eyes fell on a quote she'd framed years ago, words from a civil rights leader: "Darkness cannot drive out darkness, only light can do that. Hate cannot drive out hate, only love can do that." She'd always admired how these words balanced moral strength with tactical wisdom. The clock struck midnight, and Major Anderson straightened in her chair. The hurt was still there, but now it was accompanied by something else, a sense of purpose. She'd faced enemy fire, led troops through impossible situations, and broken barriers throughout her career. This was just another mission, but one that required a different kind of strategy. She opened a new document on her laptop and began typing. The words flowed as she outlined a plan, not for revenge, but for transformation. Her military experience had taught her that real change doesn't come from destroying the enemy, but from transforming them into allies. As she worked into the early hours of the morning, her grandfather's old clock kept ticking, marking time as she mapped out a campaign that would turn this humiliation into an opportunity for change. This wouldn't be a story about another black person being mistreated at a restaurant. No, she decided, this would be a story about how one person's response to discrimination could transform an entire community. The next morning, Major Anderson sat at her kitchen table with a cup of coffee, surrounded by papers and her laptop. The early sunlight streamed through her windows as she reviewed the research she'd done overnight. Her military training had taught her that every successful mission needs thorough preparation, and this would be no different. She discovered some interesting facts about River Heights Restaurant. Their online reviews showed a clear pattern. While the food got decent ratings, there were numerous complaints about unfriendly service, especially from minority customers. The restaurant's social media presence was weak, showing mostly food photos but very little community engagement. Their staff photos revealed what she'd noticed firsthand, a striking lack of diversity. But what really caught her attention was a local business article from 3 months ago. River Heights was struggling to attract younger customers and had seen a 30% drop in revenue over the past year. Several other upscale restaurants had opened nearby, all of them embracing modern, inclusive dining experiences. River Heights was falling behind, stuck in old ways that weren't just morally wrong, they were bad for business. She pulled out her military planning notebook, the same one she used to organize combat missions. On a fresh page, she began outlining her strategy. This wouldn't be about shaming or destroying the restaurant. Instead, she would show them how diversity and inclusion could transform their business. First, she reached out to her network. A quick call to her old college roommate, now a successful business consultant, gave her current statistics about how diverse businesses outperformed their competitors. Another call to a fellow officer who ran a popular food blog provided insights into the local dining scene and current restaurant trends. By mid-morning, she was deep into creating a comprehensive proposal. Her military experience in training and team building merged perfectly with her business degree knowledge. She designed a 3-phase plan: immediate intervention, cultural transformation, and community integration. The first phase focused on basic staff training, not just about avoiding discrimination, but about creating genuine welcome for all customers. She included real examples from her own experience, both positive and negative, showing how small actions could make huge differences in customer experience. Phase 2 dug deeper into cultural change. She drew from her military leadership experience, where she'd successfully integrated diverse teams and improved unit performance. The plan included mentorship programs, community outreach initiatives, and partnerships with local cultural organizations. The final phase was about sustainable transformation. She outlined strategies for making River Heights a community hub, not just a restaurant. Her plan included hosting cultural celebration events, partnering with veteran groups, and creating special menus that celebrated diverse culinary traditions. As she worked, she remembered her first day as a squadron leader. She'd faced skepticism then too, whispers about whether a black woman could lead effectively. She'd proven them wrong not by confrontation, but by excellence. Now she would use those same skills in a different arena. By afternoon, she'd created something remarkable. Her proposal wasn't just about diversity training, It was a complete business transformation strategy. She included market research, financial projections, and success stories from other restaurants that had made similar changes. Everything was backed by data, presented in clear, simple language that anyone could understand. She also prepared multiple versions of her presentation. One focused on the moral imperative of inclusion, another emphasized the business benefits, increased customer base, improved reputation, higher profits. A third version highlighted the community impact. She would choose which to use based on what motivated the owner most. Looking at the finished proposal, Major Anderson felt a surge of pride. This was more than just a response to one bad night. It was a chance to create real, lasting change. She thought about other people who might face similar treatment, about young black girls and boys who deserved to feel welcome everywhere they went. Her work could help make that happen. She made one final addition to the proposal, a personal note about her own journey from military service to this moment. She wrote about leadership, about transformation, about the power of choosing growth over grievance. The words came from her heart, carrying the weight of her experiences and the hope of her vision. As evening approached, she put on her civilian business suit, crisp, professional, and commanding respect. She'd learned long ago that presentation matters, especially when you're trying to change minds. Her grandfather's words echoed in her mind, "Build something better." She called the restaurant and asked to speak with the owner. Her voice was calm and professional, giving no hint of her previous experience there. When the receptionist asked about the purpose of her meeting request, Major Anderson simply said, "I have a business proposal that could transform River Heights' future." She knew this wasn't going to be easy. Change never is. But as she gathered her materials and prepared to head out, she felt something powerful, not anger, not revenge, but the quiet confidence of someone who knows they're about to make a difference. This was her new mission, and failure wasn't an option. The following afternoon, Major Anderson walked into River Heights restaurant looking very different from her last visit. Instead of her military uniform, she wore a sleek business suit, carrying a leather portfolio containing her proposal. The host, the same one from that humiliating evening, barely glanced at her as she requested to see the owner. She was led to a small office at the back of the restaurant. The owner sat behind a cluttered desk, his expression a mixture of curiosity and defensiveness. He was younger than she'd expected, maybe in his mid-40s, with worry lines creasing his forehead. The wall behind him displayed old photos of the restaurant, including one of what appeared to be his father cutting a ribbon on opening day. "You wanted to see me about a business proposal," he began, his tone making it clear he was doing her a favor by meeting. His eyes narrowed slightly as he looked at her, and she could tell he was trying to figure out if they'd met before. Major Anderson sat down, placed her portfolio on the desk, and met his gaze directly. "Yes, but first, I'd like to tell you about my dinner here 2 nights ago." She watched his expression change as recognition dawned. His face flushed, and he began to stammer what sounded like the beginning of a defensive response. She raised her hand slightly, the same gesture she used countless times to quiet a briefing room. "Please, let me finish." Her voice was calm but carried the natural authority of someone used to commanding respect. She described her experience in detail, not with anger, but with precision, as if delivering a mission report. The owner's face went through a range of emotions as she spoke, defensive, embarrassed, angry, and finally something close to shame. When she finished, he leaned back in his chair, running his hands through his hair. "Look," he began, "I wasn't here that night, but I'm sure there must be some misunderstanding." Major Anderson opened her portfolio and laid out her first document, a compilation of similar reviews and complaints from other customers. "This isn't about one night," she said, "it's about a pattern, but that's not why I'm here." She pulled out her military credentials next, laying them on the desk. His eyes widened as he read through her accomplishments, the combat missions, the leadership roles, the commendations. "I've spent 15 years leading diverse teams in high-pressure situations," she explained. "I've learned that the most dangerous problems aren't always the ones you can see clearly. Sometimes they're the ones that are so deeply embedded in your culture that you don't even notice them anymore." The owner shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "If you're planning to sue us or go to the media—" "Actually," she interrupted, pulling out her business proposal, "I'm here to help you save your restaurant." His expression changed from defensive to confused. She laid out the market research she'd gathered, the declining revenues, the changing neighborhood demographics, the success of more inclusive competitors. With each page she turned, his attention grew more focused. "Your restaurant is dying," she said simply. "Not because the food isn't good, but because you're stuck in an outdated way of thinking that's driving away customers you don't even know you're losing." She walked him through her proposal. As she spoke about specific changes and their potential impact, she could see his business instincts engaging. When she mentioned similar transformations at other establishments and their resulting profit increases, he leaned forward, truly listening for the first time. "This isn't just about doing the right thing," she explained, showing him the financial projections. "It's about ensuring your restaurant's survival in a changing world. The choice isn't between tradition and progress, it's between adaptation and extinction." The meeting stretched from its scheduled 30 minutes to over 2 hours. The owner asked questions, raised objections, but each time, Major Anderson had a ready answer backed by data and experience. She shared stories from her military career about how diverse teams consistently outperformed homogeneous ones, how inclusion wasn't just a moral imperative, but a practical advantage. "Why?" he finally asked, looking genuinely puzzled. "Why would you help us after how you were treated?" Major Anderson smiled slightly, thinking of her grandfather's words. "Because real change doesn't come from tearing things down. It comes from showing people a better way forward." She paused, letting that sink in. "I'm not here as a victim seeking revenge. I'm here as a leader offering solutions." She could see the impact of her words. The owner looked at the old photo of his father on the wall, then back at the proposal showing his restaurant's declining numbers. "This would be a big change," he said slowly. "My staff might resist." "They probably will," she agreed. "Change is always hard. That's why my proposal includes a detailed implementation plan. We start small, build trust, and grow from there. I've led teams through bigger transformations than this." As the meeting drew to a close, she made her final point. "I'm not asking for payment as a consultant. I'm not demanding anything. I'm offering you a chance to be part of a positive change, one that will benefit your business as much as it benefits the community." The owner stood up, looking at her with new respect. "I need time to think about this," he said. Major Anderson gathered her materials calmly. "Of course, change is a choice, and it has to be your choice. But remember, choosing to do nothing is also a choice, and it's one that's already costing you." She left her card on his desk and walked out, knowing she'd given him a lot to think about. As she drove home, she felt oddly peaceful. Whether he accepted her proposal or not, she'd done something more powerful than seeking revenge. She'd offered a path forward, a way to transform pain into progress. That alone was a victory worth celebrating. 3 days after the meeting, Major Anderson's phone rang. The restaurant owner had made his decision. He wanted to move forward with her proposal. What followed over the next 6 months would transform not just a restaurant, but an entire community's perspective on what was possible when people chose growth over grudges. The first day of training was tense. Major Anderson stood before the restaurant staff in a conference room they'd rented nearby. Some employees sat with arms crossed, others looked at their phones, and a few, including the host who had treated her so poorly, couldn't quite meet her eyes. She recognized the resistance. She'd seen it before in military units resistant to change. "I'm not here to shame anyone," she began, her voice calm but firm. "I'm here because this restaurant has the potential to be something extraordinary, and you're all going to be part of making that happen." She shared real stories from customers, both positive and negative experiences, letting the staff see their impact through others' eyes. The host finally spoke up, his voice defensive. "We can't help it if some people are too sensitive." Major Anderson cut him off gently but firmly. "Let me tell you about sensitivity in a war zone." She described a mission where understanding cultural differences had saved lives. "Being aware of others isn't weakness, it's a strength that can determine success or failure." Week by week, she saw small changes. The kitchen staff, initially skeptical, became enthusiastic when she brought in guest chefs from different cultural backgrounds to share techniques and recipes. The server's body language shifted from defensive to curious during training sessions. Even the host began to show signs of genuine interest in learning about unconscious bias and its impact. One breakthrough came during a role-playing exercise. Major Anderson had staff members switch roles. Servers became customers, kitchen staff became hosts. She gave him scenarios based on real experiences, including her own. Watching the host try to navigate a situation where he was made to feel unwelcome was particularly powerful. Afterward, he pulled her aside. "I never realized," he said quietly. "I mean, I knew what I was doing wasn't right, but I never really understood how it felt." His admission wasn't just about guilt, it showed real understanding. The owner proved surprisingly committed to change. He invested in new training materials, updated hiring practices, and even renovated the restaurant's entrance to be more welcoming. When some regular customers complained about the changes, he stood firm, explaining his vision for a more inclusive dining experience. Major Anderson introduced the staff to local veterans groups, creating special events that brought together diverse communities. The kitchen began featuring monthly special menus celebrating different cultures, with staff members contributing family recipes and stories. What started as a diversity initiative became a genuine celebration of community. The transformation wasn't always smooth. There were setbacks and resistant staff members. Some longtime customers left, uncomfortable with the changes, but for every customer who left, 3 new ones came in, drawn by the restaurant's growing reputation for excellent food and genuinely welcoming service. One memorable evening, about 4 months into the transformation, a young black couple came in for their anniversary dinner. Major Anderson, there for a routine check-in, watched as the host, the same one who had tried to turn her away, greeted them warmly, shared menu recommendations, and ensured they had the best table in the house. The genuine smile on his face showed this wasn't just training, it was real change. The restaurant's social media began featuring stories of their staff and customers, highlighting the diverse community they were building. Reviews started mentioning not just the food, but the warm, inclusive atmosphere. Revenue began to climb as word spread about the changes. Major Anderson implemented a mentorship program, pairing experienced staff with new hires from diverse backgrounds. The kitchen, once a tense environment, became a place where different cultures and cooking styles merged to create exciting new dishes. The owner even started a scholarship program for aspiring chefs from underserved communities. The most touching moment came during a community dinner event. An elderly black veteran, hearing about the restaurant's transformation, shared his own story of being turned away from restaurants in the 1960s. He spoke about how seeing the changes at River Heights gave him hope. There wasn't a dry eye in the house as staff members, both old and new, listened to his story. 6 months in, the restaurant had become unrecognizable from its former self, not just in policy, but in spirit. The staff moved through their duties with a new sense of pride and purpose. The dining room buzzed with diverse voices and laughter. Even the food had evolved, incorporating influences from various cultures while maintaining its high standards. But perhaps the most significant change was in the staff themselves. The defensive postures were gone, replaced by genuine warmth. They had learned that inclusion wasn't about following rules, it was about creating a space where everyone could feel at home. The transformation had done more than save a struggling restaurant. It had shown an entire community what was possible when people chose to embrace change rather than resist it. 1 year after that humiliating evening, Major Anderson stood in front of River Heights restaurant, hardly believing the transformation before her. The old brass handles still gleamed on the doors, but now they opened to a very different world inside. The warm lighting spilled onto a sidewalk that buzzed with diverse groups of diners waiting for their tables, chatting and laughing together. Inside, the restaurant hummed with energy. The host, the same one who had tried to turn her away a year ago, was warmly greeting an elderly couple in wheelchairs, personally ensuring their comfort as he guided them to an easily accessible table. In the corner, a group of young professionals from different backgrounds shared plates of food, their conversation flowing as freely as the wine. The owner had organized a special anniversary event, not to celebrate the restaurant's founding, but to mark 1 year since the beginning of its transformation. Local news crews set up their cameras as community leaders gathered for what had become one of the city's most talked about success stories. Major Anderson watched as the kitchen doors swung open, revealing a staff that now reflected the diversity of their city. The new menu combined the restaurant's classic dishes with influences from various cultures, creating something uniquely their own. Regular customers now included people from all walks of life: business executives, college students, families, and veterans. The owner stepped up to the microphone, his face showing both pride and humility. A year ago, he began, "This restaurant was dying, not just financially, but spiritually. We had forgotten the true meaning of hospitality, that it means welcoming everyone, not just some." He paused, looking around the room. "We were saved not by a business consultant or a marketing expert, but by someone we had wronged." He gestured toward Major Anderson, and the room burst into applause. She hadn't wanted to be the center of attention, but the owner had insisted that their story needed to be told. As she walked to the front, she saw faces in the crowd that reflected the change. The host who had become one of their strongest advocates for inclusion, servers who now led diversity training at other restaurants, regular customers who had watched the transformation unfold. "When I walked into this restaurant a year ago," she said, her voice steady and clear, "I had two choices. I could respond to discrimination with anger, or I could offer a path to change. My grandfather, who faced much worse in his time, taught me that the strongest response to hatred isn't more hatred, it's showing people a better way." She spoke about the past year's journey, the resistant staff members who became champions of change, the skeptical customers who became their biggest supporters, the community partnerships that had flourished. The restaurant had become more than just a place to eat. It was a model for how businesses could transform themselves. Local business leaders in the audience nodded as she shared the numbers: revenue up by 40%, a staff turnover rate that had dropped to nearly zero, and a waiting list for reservations that stretched weeks in advance. But more importantly, she talked about the less measurable changes, the genuine smiles, the conversations between people who might never have met otherwise, the sense of community that filled the space. The host stood up to speak next, his voice thick with emotion. "I was the one who tried to turn Major Anderson away that night," he admitted publicly for the first time. "I carried prejudices I didn't even realize I had. Learning to see them, to face them, and to change them has made me not just a better employee, but a better person." As the evening continued, stories flowed from staff and customers alike. A young waitress talked about how the mentorship program had given her confidence she never knew she had. A regular customer shared how the restaurant had become a place where he could bring business clients of any background, knowing they would feel welcomed and respected. The kitchen staff had prepared a special menu for the evening, each dish telling part of their story. The appetizer was a fusion of Southern and Asian cuisines, created during one of their cultural exchange programs. The main course combined traditional French techniques with African spices, representing the blending of old and new. Even the dessert told a story, a classic crème brûlée with a modern twist, showing how tradition could evolve without being lost. Major Anderson looked around at what her choice had created. The restaurant had become a case study in successful business transformation, with other establishments in the city beginning to follow their example. The owner now gave talks about inclusive business practices, and their training program had become a model for other restaurants. But perhaps the most powerful moment came at the end of the evening. A group of young black military officers, having heard about the restaurant's story, had come to dine. Watching them being treated with impeccable respect and courtesy, Major Anderson felt tears in her eyes. This was why she had chosen to build rather than destroy, so that others might never have to face what she had faced. The owner closed the evening with a final announcement. He was establishing a scholarship fund named in honor of Major Anderson's grandfather to help minority students attend culinary school. It was his way of ensuring that the change they had started would continue into the future. As the crowds began to disperse, Major Anderson stood for a moment in the spot where she had once been made to wait. The space felt different now, warmer, more welcoming, filled with the kind of energy that only comes when people truly feel at home. She thought about her grandfather's words about building something better and smiled. Sometimes the best revenge isn't revenge at all, it's showing people how to be better than they ever thought they could be.